Applebaum's Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, is a lament for the death of democracy in parts of the world that Anne knows well, and a warning in those parts of the world where Anne is deeply worried about the future of democracy. Anne is a past winner of the Lionel Gelber Prize for Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine. Hello, I'm Janice Stein, the chair of the Lionel Gelber Prize, and with me is Anne Applebaum, the winner of the Pulitzer Prize and a previous winner of the Lionel Gelber Prize, here today to talk about her nominated book, Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. Welcome back, Anne. It is great to see you.
Great to see you as well. Very nice to be with you again.
Anne, I read the introduction to your book. I'm sure you've been asked this before, with this gripping story of your New Year's Eve party. And leave aside that I'm wowed that you can cook vats of stew, which is way beyond my capability. What comes through is the optimism, the excitement that Poland was on the verge of a new and long-awaited chapter in its history. That's not where you are now, and the book is really about what's gone wrong. Walk us through what went wrong.
So thank you. I mean, that is the topic of the book, and so to fully explain, to fully answer the question took me whatever it was, 150 pages. But I will start here. So yes, the book starts with a New Year's Eve party, it's really not a book about parties, and I'm not that great at giving parties or anything like that. It was just that parties are a useful metaphor for groups of people or groups of friends and acquaintances. And the book is partly about how and why acquaintances who seemed to agree with one another in 1999, which is when the party took place, really didn't 20 years later. And my book is mostly about the center-right, because that was the sort of group that I was part of, both in Poland and in Britain and the United States at that time. And in particular in Poland, it's really about anti-communists. There was a very clear and distinct anti-communist opposition. There were people who had worked together on underground newspapers, who had been part of overthrowing the regime in 1989. Most of our friends were on the younger end of that scale. Maybe they were high school activists or university activists. They weren't leaders, but they still felt themselves attached to this movement that they'd been part of. And in 1999, we all felt ourselves to be on the same page. We all wanted Poland to be a democracy. We wanted it to be, to have.
Just to interject for a minute, do you think that what united you was your anti-communism? Or was it the shared, and because that's quite different, as you make clear in the book, from a shared commitment to democracy. It's that shared commitment to democracy that comes a part of this.
Sure. So this is what I was about to explain, is that yes, there were lots of reasons to be an anti-communist, and this is even a more profound thing to say. I mean, it's more important actually, even about the West, about Western anti-communists in the United States and elsewhere. Some people were anti-communists because they were Democrats and they believed in human rights, and they wanted those regimes to end so that people would have more freedom and society would be more open. Some people were anti-communists in the US because they were interested in realpolitik and nuclear weapons and American influence in the world. Some people were anti-communist because they were Christians. And communism was anti-Christian, Marxism was atheist, and they wanted the regimes overthrown for that reason. In Central Europe, some people were anti-communist because they were nationalists and they objected to the Soviet Union telling them what to do, and they didn't like the Soviet occupation of their countries. And these strands overlapped with one another, and sometimes people were part of one or both of them. But the point is that after communism fell apart, then some of the bonds that had held those groups together also fell apart. And they discovered that they didn't actually, in this post-communist world, in the world of the new democracy, or in the US or Europe, in the world of the 1990s, when the game was no longer fighting the Soviet Union, but rather putting Europe back together again, they found that they didn't really agree with one another anymore. And then you begin to have deep differences between these groups.
Are you surprised, though, as a historian? I mean, you're describing a fairly generalized pattern that people come together in a social movement, they're united in opposition, but as soon as they come to power, as soon as they succeed, success breeds exactly what you're describing: factionalism, division.
I'm not sure there's a hard and fast rule like that. But it's true that it's easier to be together when you're all opposed to something than it is when you're all arguing for something. And you see in other kinds of liberation movements or other kinds of political parties, when things shift, they splinter. I mean, but that's actually something that happens. Well, one of the points of the book, and this is what I was getting to, is that's actually something that happens all the time. Political coalitions form and are created in response to a certain set of circumstances, and then they reform themselves and change in response to other ones. In the book, I talk a little bit about the Dreyfus case, very famous story from 19th century France, when all of French society divided bitterly into different groups. The one salon arguing with the different salon, over the question of whether Alfred Dreyfus, who was a French army officer who was Jewish, had been a traitor or not. And it's a long story. I give you the details in the book. He was falsely accused, in fact, by the French army, and there was false evidence created against him. And the division in society, often among people who had previously not known that they disagreed with one another, was very profound. And suddenly, a lot of social and political alliances that had existed before changed because people suddenly discovered they had very different feelings about this case. And it's well described even in French literature and at the time. Marcel Proust, the French writer, has these funny descriptions of people in one salon, they suddenly stop speaking to the ones in the other, it's very reminiscent actually of what Poland has been like in the last several years, and also what a lot of the U.S. is like, and other countries as well, with people who were allies suddenly discovering that when faced with a different set of issues, they no longer they're no longer on the same side.
These are such painful splits, frankly, because they're personal. Many, they split families, they split friends. These are not just political differences. They go much, much deeper and are extraordinarily painful, even among the Dreyfusards, as you accurately say. And, the story of Dreyfus in your book plays an interesting role, because running through the seductive lure of authoritarianism in Poland, Britain, and even in the United States, which is quite astonishing, and you trace this, is a resurgence of anti-Semitism, a vocabulary that a resurgence of anti-Semitism. People had thought that would go away in Poland. But it begins to come back. It comes back in some of the militias that were mobilized in the United States by Trump. It comes back in all places in the Labour Party in Britain. And that, I think, to many is a surprise. That was something that people hoped had died out, but it hasn't in what you call the nostalgia that you write about.
Well, so I mean, those are two slightly separate things: the question of anti-Semitism and the question of nostalgia. But yes, I mean, I think anti-Semitism and new versions of it. In Poland, there's now a form of homophobia, which takes almost exactly the same form as older forms of anti-Semitism. I mean, the need to find a scapegoat, one that is both anti, that's opposed to the somehow is undermining the purity of the nation and is somehow also controlling the nation. This is very common, and you see it across a lot of cultures and a lot of places and times. I don't think you have to be an East European nation to have it. I mean, as you've just said, you can see it in Britain, you can see it in America. I'm sure you can find it in Canada too. The desire to find a people or a group or an ethnicity or somebody who can be blamed for the degeneration of the state or the reason why things aren't going the way they should is very, very old.
I use the word nostalgia a little bit differently from the way you do in the book, but it is a nostalgia for a Christian Europe, for a white America. It looks back at a time that was, and that is certainly the tone of some of the authoritarians that you write about.
Right. So in the book I have a chapter on nostalgia, and what I would call I didn't make up this term. It comes from a Russian writer called Svetlana Boym, and what I write about is restorative nostalgia. In other words, the kind of nostalgia you describe, a longing for the past and a longing for the way that things were, but coupled with the belief that we can rebuild things just like that, and that we can start again and once again have a white America or a Christian Europe, even if those things were never quite the way we remembered. And so the desire to bring that back is a sort of, it's a kind of authoritarian counterpart to the old, the Marxist idea that, we need to erase the present in order to create a better future. You now get a different authoritarian idea, which is that we need to erase the present in order to bring back the past. That's very different from another idea of conservatism that has been really the dominant one, especially in Anglo-American cultures, which is a Burkean idea of conservatism, namely that we should allow things to evolve, that things will always change. We should revere the past and think about the past and always take what's good from the past, but we don't bring the past back and reimpose it on the present. But that impulse to do that is something you hear in modern authoritarianism. Actually, you hear it from Putin. You heard a version of it from Trump. You hear a version of it from the Law and Justice Party that runs Poland.
If you look at the array of conservative forces, it seems that the Burkeans, who paid so much attention, as you say, to evolutionary change, but also to community and the importance of community, they've lost ground to the restorative nostalgics.
So yes, a certain brand of conservatism, center-right conservatism that was very invested in democracy, very invested in the transatlantic alliance, very invested in the rule of law, very invested also in a particular. It was a social idea of conservatism that was also to do with the conservatism of behavior. You didn't shout, you didn't say, it was anti-extremist, I would say. Yes, this kind of conservatism has absolutely lost out. Certainly in America, in a different way in Britain, and also in other countries as well. And it's lost out to extremism, to a form of conservatism which isn't even really conservative anymore. It's radical, in that it seeks to undermine. Undermine the state as it is, that it seeks to impose something different, that it seeks to, in some cases, certainly in the Trumpist case, that didn't accept the rules of democracy, didn't accept the outcome of a U.S. election. This is something that wouldn't even be recognized as conservative, 20 or 30 years ago. It's a radical, kind of Bolshevik, extremist movement. And this is what's come to be called conservatism in a lot of places. And again, the book describes why it is that people have been attracted to it.
Is this a permanent defeat or is it a temporary defeat when you look ahead now? Because that, I think, for people who are concerned about the future of democracy, certainly in the United States, that question takes the form, are we just on a break? Are we going to get a break for 4 years? But who has the wind in their sails here? Because if your analysis is right, and the radical version is in fact ascendant, then we're just at the beginning of a very hard struggle.
So nothing is permanent. I mean, I hate this is an answer that people always find irritating, but look, nothing is permanent. Neither are we guaranteed to have, a radicalized extremist Republican Party for the rest of our lives, nor are we guaranteed that won't happen. But both remain possible. I mean, certainly the forces that created Trumpism are not gone, and the online and broadcast and other forms of media that created it and supported it are still there, and their business model very much depends on creating outrage and pushing people into extremist groups. So that's all still there. I mean, the problems with American democracy in the sense that people have of being unrepresented is also still there. And the sense of loss that some people have, that America has changed in so many ways, and it's changed in ways that make it unrecognizable to others. This is also there, and this is also very real to people. So no, I don't think it's gone, but there's no reason to assume, therefore, that it is victorious or even that it will emerge again in 4 years in exactly the same form.
If you look at the forces that drove the rise of what you're describing, in order for those forces to recede, and you come to this in the concluding chapter of your book, but for those forces to recede, what vectors have to change in modern democratic states? And by the way, we did not talk about France, where there are very similar forces. We didn't talk about Hungary, which fits the model that you've described very well, Anne. So this is something that goes way beyond the Anglosphere and Poland. It's a much wider phenomenon.
Yes, no. I mean, in the book does talk. I talk about Spain. I talk a little bit about France. I talk about some other countries too. Yes, I mean I referred already to the way in which the internet has radicalized us, and the way and the very structure. I've actually just written a very long article, which is in this month's Atlantic magazine, about how to think differently about the internet, how to restructure it so that it reflects democratic values and not the oligarchic or oligopolistic values of a few small companies. That's one of the forces that is driving us apart, that's creating polarization, and polarization in turn leads to a lot of political disillusion. I think the kleptocracy in the broadest sense, the degree to which very wealthy people are no longer part of polities and no longer subject to the rule of law, and can move money around the world in very fast ways and then use it for political gain. Is another piece of the story. Getting some control over that is something that Western democratic nations should be able to do together. Then there are specific problems in each country. In the U.S., we have this problem of the very unrepresentative Senate, which is, which makes, it's been a problem for 100 years and or more. So, which makes it very hard to achieve any kind of change because the rural America is so outvotes urban America. But many, I think many of our democracies have outdated institutions, created 100 or 200 years ago, based on ways of doing politics that aren't really current anymore. And rethinking both how we debate things, are there ways we can use the online sphere more creatively, how government functions, how it could be made more effective, how democracy could be made more effective. I mean, I think almost every democracy needs a real, a look at how it works in the digital age, and is it really representative of its citizens anymore? I mean, it's almost a universal problem.
It is. And institutional change is so hard and so slow because institutions get so deep. We worry when they are not deeply embedded, as they aren't in Poland and in Hungary, and we worry when they are deeply embedded, as they are in the UK and the United States. So there's been a lot of commentary, and in the wake of President Biden's massive stimulus bill, that embedded in that effort is something that can break this trajectory, because it actually does two very different things at the same time. It reaches out to those who have suffered most, both since the global financial crisis and certainly in the pandemic, that bottom third who has really had a horrible time of it in that bookended decade. But it also reaches above them to the broader middle class that ultimately has to support democracy and has to support a system that redistributes. Are you hopeful when you look at what President Biden has done, that he's at the beginning of building a broader coalition for governments that can work for people?
And that's certainly his intention. Many things can go wrong. I mean, there are serious, even left-wing economists who worry about inflation and other ways in which this huge spending bill could go wrong. I mean, large amounts of money sloshing around can have different effects than the ones that we expect, and that's been true in history before. So I don't want to overdo I can't predict the outcome of this one particular piece of legislation, although of course it's very important. The bigger question is whether Biden can. It's not just about what he does, it's also about whether he can shift the conversation more broadly. Can he get Americans to talk about how to fix things and how to make the economy better and how to end the virus, and get them to stop focusing on culture wars and outrage and playing games with identity politics that simply that create more anger and aggression. Because a lot of politics is that now. It's not so much about, it's not a policy discussion. It's a kind of clash of symbols. I think my understanding is that the administration does understand this, and that's partly explains, for example, you will not hear Biden speaking about Trump very much, or speaking about the election and the arguments over, was it stolen? He just stays away from that subject, and he's trying to focus on pragmatic, real life issues. And I think if the Democrats are successful in just changing the thrust of the conversation, then I think they will, then there's there's a chance that they can create a majority for some kind of reform and real economic change.
It's interesting that you use the word pragmatic. What you're saying, I think, Anne, is that these next 5 years or so, we need, in a sense, a return to pragmatism, a quieter politics, which focuses on what can actually get done and what can actually get fixed in countries that are deeply divided and deeply polarized.
Yes, I mean, if Biden is able to focus on what government can do for you, this is a particularly American problem. This is not the same kind of problem that we have in every European country, but in America there's an enormous amount of distrust of government and lack of faith in government, and so what Biden is trying to do is to resurrect that.
Yeah, and that will be. I think we're all, again, people who care about democracy are behind that effort. Let me just ask you one last question, Anne. When we look at France and we see a president, Macron came to office essentially as a defender of democracy. And as he approaches the last year of his presidency, he's deeply, deeply engaged in identity politics, as you call it, and is in an all-out competition for the presidency with an even more radicalized version in Marine Le Pen. France is absolutely critical to the future of Europe. How worried are you?
France is critical, but I mean, France is critical, Germany's critical, even the direction of politics in Britain is still critical. Yes, I think we will see a battle between Republican France and a kind of, an ethnic nationalist France that will play itself out over the next couple of years in the run up to the election. And you're right, it's not guaranteed who will win.
But it seems that, again, the fulcrum has moved here toward identity politics in ways that would dismay, friends of French democracy. Let me put it that way.
Sure. I mean, and it's moved everywhere in that same way. But I mean, again, I can't predict what will happen over the next 2 years. And it does seem to me Macron is more likely to succeed the more he will be able to point to practical achievements. And a lot depends on how Europe emerges from the lockdowns. There's an enormous amount of money coming France's way and coming the way of other countries. How the EU is borrowing money for the first time in large quantities, and so how that works and how that fund is spent will also make a big difference as to how people perceive the French government.
Now here's a very unfair last question. And you've already said 3 times you can't predict, and that's absolutely true. None of us can. If we were having this conversation 5 years from now, at a restaurant where we could actually be together and talk one another, would it be a relatively happy evening in Europe?
I can't answer that. I'll say yes, because I think it's very irresponsible to be pessimistic. It's very unfair to younger people. And so I would say yes, let's imagine a world in which Europe gets through this current crisis and emerges stronger.
Thank you very much, Anne, for spending time with us. To all our listeners, The Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism by Anne Applebaum. An absolutely superb and personal trip through an extraordinarily painful time in recent history. I encourage everyone to read the book.